sign up for an account here. Just make sure you have all the necessary accounts for deployment. We're going to deploy our architectures on here. We need to install a couple what's called NPM modules. I'm guessing you guys already know that. So the first thing we need to install is Gulp. So make sure you have that installed globally. And it's going to require, you may already have it, so if you do, don't worry about it. But if you don't, just go ahead and do that. It's going to ask for your password. Go ahead and enter your password. All right. Next is Webpack. So again, you may already have this. If you do, just last but not least is my CLI, the Turbo CLI, which is your liaison from your local development environment to your Turbo account. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, and then Turbo version. Make sure you have this version, which is the most up-to-date version right now. All right. So since I'm going to improvise a little bit, because I'm going to go a little bit further than, or I'm going to basically focus on React Redux rather than just pure web. Basically what that means is I'm going to do some freestyling here. I'm going to improvise a little bit. So just sort of bear with me as I think out loud. But the actual thing we're going to build should be the same thing. We're going to build basically a comment posting system, and that's it. That's pretty simple. So first thing you want to do is cd to wherever you do your work. So I'm just going to do it on desktop. Okay. Turbo comes with a couple scaffolding options. So one of them is React, which gives you a full stack React Redux environment just out of the box, just completely out of the box. So React, Redux, and a Node Express environment on the back end, which really, really cuts down on your setup time. All right, so we're gonna use that because otherwise the entire demo would just be setting up, to be honest. So let's get past all that, and let's use the Turbo new Reddit. So here is the React flag specifier. So if you didn't do that, you just get a pure Node Express environment, and that's it. Just regular Node Express. Okay. The Turbo is a full stack JavaScript framework environment. Okay. So once you scaffold the project, cd into it. And just because it's Node Express, you have to run the installs, right? And it installs a whole series of packages that you need to run a full stack React Redux environment. So React, Babel, React Redux, all that stuff is being currently installed so that you can just go ahead and start programming. This normally takes about a minute, so while this is going, we're going to head over to Turbo right now and log in, which you probably already did, so I'm going to log in. Alrighty, and then over here on the right side, this is where you create your projects on Turbo, so you have your deployment environment set up. So go ahead and give it the same name. Okay, make sure it says Vertex. Go ahead and just create that. And we're going to need to grab the app ID, so just copy that into your clipboard. And this will connect to our local source to our remote Turbo project. So by now, this should be almost done. So the next thing we're going to do is connect our local source code to our project on the remote. I'm going to run the dev server real quick, make sure everything works, and then get started on the actual project. Okay? Alrighty, so mine's done. It looks like this when it's finished. So make sure you see the same thing. Next thing we're going to do is connect our source code to our remote project. So Turbo app, and then paste that in. It's kind of like connecting to a GitHub repo. It's the same kind of general thought process. Next thing we want to do is run the dev server, which is just localhost 3000. So turbo dev server. Head over to localhost 3000. Make sure you see the scaffold. This is the scaffold just generated out of the box. And this is, by the way, React Redux. So this isn't just raw HTML. It's being rendered through a series of React components, okay? Connected to a Redux architecture. So now that we've confirmed that, go ahead and turn off the server by doing Control-C. All right? Everyone with me? And last but not least, we're going to do a quick deploy so you know how it works to deploy to staging. So Turbo provides staging environments for free. You can create as many staging projects as you want. Just go ahead and do it. And this is currently being deployed to the Turbo architecture where we can test the staging link versus the local environment.
Real quick,
Sure.
being told, please log in.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. You gotta log in. Otherwise, it won't know who's doing this. So just put in your email password that you use for Turbo. Yep, Turbo login and then email password. Okay. So after you log in and then you do Turbo deploy, okay, it'll give you and it'll send your source code up. It'll give you a link for staging. So just go ahead and click on that. So here's my staging link. And my staging should look the same. See, that's my staging link as the localhost, which means it worked. We're ready to go. So our local and our staging environments sync up. So we're ready to proceed. Okay.
You mentioned for the login, it was the email that we signed up with?
Correct. That you use for Turbo. It authenticates with Turbo. So
What do you do with the app ID again?
you copy your app ID from the dashboard, you do Turbo app, and then you paste in your app ID, whatever that long string of characters is, and just do enter. Okay, so far what we've done is we've scaffolded a project, connected it to our remote project on our accounts, then did a quick deploy, just to get the entire loop closed, make sure everything works on both sides, and then once we've confirmed that, we can begin our development. So, who has it working on staging? Good. Yep. Question?
Just to go to that other screen there in your browser.
Yeah.
What was the step after we logged in and we deployed?
Oh, just go to the staging link. So the deploy should give you a bunch of lines. At the bottom it says, deployment complete. It'll give you a link where your website is published, and you just publish the website. So you copy that and check it out, make sure it works.
And if we run like Turbo app with that key, again, we should be able to go to localhost and see the app running?
No, Turbo Dev Server.
Dev server.
Dev server.
Correct.
Okay. So here's the project that was scaffolded by Turbo. Now we can open it up and explore the source code, the architecture, and all that stuff. So here is the source code that was scaffolded for us. Clearly there's a handful of things already set up. What's important are the following. If you look at the views directory and the index.mustache, you will see the home page, the Welcome to Turbo homepage. That's this right here. However, all those HTML contents you don't see, right? All you see is line 6, which is a root, and these imports down here. The ones that matter are lines 12 and 13, which are the React Redux imports. The way you probably already know this, but the way React Redux works is that this code finds the root and injects the UI inside the root div. So that's called client-side rendering, and that's why you don't see hardly anything here except the imports. Okay. So then that begs the question, where's all the React code? The React code begins in the src directory right here. You see this? So if you open up the src directory, you'll see over here is where we have the entire React and Redux architecture. Okay? And right now, for now, the only file that matters is this one right here, index.js. So if we open this up, you will see our what's called our entry point. This is the React code that actually renders inside the root div. Okay? There's a little brief explanation here, but this demo will cover all that anyway. So if you look at line 15 or line 14 on my screen, you'll see where it says document get element by ID root, and then that's where it says grab the root div and inject these contents instead. Okay? So this intro component right here, is what you see over here. Okay? And that's it. So that's all scaffolded for you. So if you look at the intro component itself, you'll see inside the components and then intro, here's where you'll see all that code that you expected to see. See, welcome to Turbo. You were looking at the intro component, whatever. Like, here's all that HTML that you would have otherwise expected to see. Okay? So this is clearly just an intro component. We don't really want that, right? We want to use our own stuff. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the intro component. So everyone do that right now. Get rid of it. And for the time being, don't worry about the provider. I'm guessing you kind of already know what that is, but for now, just ignore it. And we're going to insert our own contents instead. Okay. So here's where we can do our sort of UI building, and we can then make sure that that's what we see instead. So if I go back to my terminal and run the dev server, so turbo dev server, and I reload the project on localhost 3000, you're not going to see any change. Right? Nothing changed. This is a problem. The problem is because React is a compiled, you have to compile the source code, which we did not do. Okay, so the code compiles through Webpack. So that's why we installed Webpack a few minutes earlier. That's why. So what you want to do right now is go back to your terminal and open a new tab through Command-T and type in just Webpack. Just run Webpack, right? So right now we are recompiling our code, which will deliver the output files, re-deliver the output files. So you should see a bunch of green lines like this, which obviously means that's good, right? So the compilation was successful, the build succeeded. So now I can go back to my home page and hopefully I'll see what I wrote a few minutes ago. Good? And that's basically the React flow of development. You write your code, you compile, you test, you write your code, you compile, you test, or you verify, really, so forth and so on. That's essentially React development, okay? I mean, it's obviously very simplified, but that's the thought process that goes on. You write your code, you compile, you verify, continue. All right?
Did we set up a Webpack watcher to?
We're going to do that in a few minutes. That's correct. All right, everyone got that working? All right, so by now you probably know React is built upon a series of components. Your UIs are basically compositions of subcomponents, right? So this right here really isn't best practice, right? Really, this should be its own component, right? Let's go ahead and create our components. So here, let's go back here. Inside the directory structure, we have src, components, and then containers, right? So let's turn off our server and let's navigate into those directories. So cd src, components, containers, and let's create our first component here, right? It might be our only component. I'm not really sure. So let's see. Let's create our component. This component, what are we going to do here? This is essentially going to be like one of the subs of a Reddit page, right? So like if you're on like the fantasy sports sub and you see a bunch of fantasy sports like comments, like that, this is the page upon which we're going to see that. Okay, so let's call it sub. Sorry, thank you. Okay, and then make sure you CB back to the root level, because that's generally where you want to be at all times. All right. So if we open up our sub container. Obviously, it's empty because we just created it. So let's get something on there right away. So we import React. Let's see. Okay, so right here is basically the simplest component possible. We have lines 7, 8, 9 are really like what matters here. The component, whenever we use the component, it will render this HTML content. Okay, that's essentially what's going on here. So we can reuse this component wherever, and it will just re-render this HTML content. Okay, and this is a component. It's a bona fide component. So now let's get this guy loaded inside the entry point rather than that initial text we had before. All right, but before I do that, is everyone with me? Okay, I'm going to head over to the index right here inside the containers directory. So it gets confusing because there's like many indexes, right? So head over to the index in the containers directory. Right, they give you, Turbo gives you a free like sort of container example. We're not going to use that. Let's get rid of the examples and let's export our sub container instead. And I'll explain the definition of like container like later as we get to it. Okay. So now let's head over to the actual entry point. So the src index. Right, and then over here, let's do sub from containers. Okay, and then we get rid of all this stuff because it's done. We're done with it. And let's render our sub component instead. So we do sub. So just like before, we have to recompile, right? But what, I'm sorry, what was your name, miss?
Aruna.
Oh, I'm sorry?
Aruna.
Aruna. What Aruna was saying was that like, rather than just recompile over and over again, we can just have it watch, right? So we do webpack-w like this, and that way we don't have to remember to do it over and over again. It'll just compile the changes. Every time we make changes, it'll just recompile, okay? And then don't forget to run the dev server, turbo dev server. Okay, cool. So now we have that rendering properly, which means inside the sub component, we can really build out our UI now. We can build all our stuff in there. Let's go ahead and do that. So set up a very basic UI for like posting a comment, reading comments, whatever, and just build it out through there, okay? So inside the sub component, let's see, how do we want to make this look? So a Reddit sub basically consists of like just a stream of like comments, I guess, that you can click on. And let's say on the right side, I don't know if this is how Reddit actually looks, but on the right side, let's have another one where you can post a comment. Okay, so we'll use some bootstrap columns. Left side, comment, row of comments, or a column of comments. And on the right side is you can enter a new comment. Very simple, very basic. Obviously, it's not going to look just like Reddit. So here, let's do class name. Let's create a row. Bootstrap is already in here, so we can go ahead and use Bootstrap classes. Okay, let's create two columns, just like I described, a left and a right. let's do 8 and 4. Okay, pretty simple, right? Just splitting it up into 2 sections, 2-to-1 ratio. Here, let's do the sub name, right? So let's do H2 on this. And let's say our sub is going to be tech, because we're all tech nerds. And then let's do, let's see here. Let's create a couple of fake comments, I guess. So div. Comments generally consist of a title and some body text, right? So let's do H3, title, p tag, text body. And for now, let's just make like 3 of these sample posts, and let's begin with that. Okay, so our Webpack is currently watching, right? So we don't have to remember to recompile. So just check in on Webpack. See, it actually rebuilt like 3 times just now because I made a series of changes. And let's just see how that looks. Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot to be desired, but for now, this is gonna be how it's set up. Okay. How's everyone doing? Good. And then let's head over to our entry point. No, let's not do that. I take that back. Let's do one more thing here. Let's do. Let's take this entire. All the contents of the component and wrap it inside of another div like this, whose class name is container, which is what it should have been the whole time. Okay, so this is what I meant by like, bear with me while I just sort of improvise my way through this. So that's going to give me some padding on the sides. Okay. Right, just give me some room to work with is essentially what just happened there. All right, you guys see what I did? So again, these are just bootstrap classes I'm using, just regular bootstrap. All right, how are we doing so far? Good? Okay, so then here, let's create some inputs. Let's do H3, submit comment, input, text, placeholder, title, right? Title. Go with form control. Okay, just an input field for a title. So regular input field. Line 30, make sure you have that. And it gives me this over here. And let's submit, I'm sorry, not submit, let's add a text area for the actual like text body, right? Because it could be, a couple hundred words or whatever. So typically you want to leave more room for this. Okay. And then after that, let's throw in a button. And then just call it submit. And we'll go with that for now. So again, Webpack has been watching the whole time, so you want to make sure everything is good over here, which it is. and then just reload and make sure everything looks fine. I mean, again, there's it could look a lot better, but we're just setting things up. So let's just go with this for now. Okay. How are you guys doing so far? I'm going to tighten up this UI. Actually, it bothers me too much. So I'm going to do let's do column 6 here. 6 and 3. What's 6 and 3? It's 9, right? So let's do let's do 6. I'm just being really nitpicky, so just bear with me. Let's try this, and then I'm going to do call md offset 2. Just tighten it up a little, just get it down the middle. All right, cool. So obviously this is just UI setup, right? This isn't going to be the actual way we set up the UI, right? So what we really want to do is get this data from a data source, which we're going to use the state for that. Components come with what's called state, where you can basically bind data among other things. So we're going to render this information here, or these posts, I guess. We're going to render these from the state variable, or the state of the component. So the first thing we want to do is set up the state. So constructor. Okay, so here we have the state. We just set it up. And what we want to do is create an array in there where the posts will be stored. Okay, so say posts. And these are going to be an array of JSON objects. The posts have basically a title and a text, and that's it for now, right? So title, text. iPhone X released. Check out the new iPhone X. And let's just put in a couple fake comments. Elon Musk elected president. Beat Trump by 90%. Elon Musk builds us on Mars. I don't know, I'm just coming up with stuff. Costs $11 trillion USD. AI taking over the world. Mars. Okay. A couple comments that we now have, some basic data to work with. So now let's iterate through this array of posts to render this instead, right? That's the more accurate way this is going to happen anyway. So here, before I move ahead, does everyone have this? Because it's going to be off the screen in a second.
Do you mind scrolling down a little bit to the column 2? I think I missed something.
Down, right down
Yeah,
here.
right
Okay,
down.
this is where I was going to go anyway, so right here. So right here is where we want to iterate through that array and render each one of these div tags. So we do like this dot state posts map. That's called mapping, right? And then we just iterate through each one. And inside each one of these map iterations, we just return the div tag. But now we have access to the data. So we can just take the post and render the title instead of literally the word title, right? So post title and post, I think it was text, right? All right, thank you. And then everything inside of an iteration needs a key, so just give it the index for now. and that'll be good for now. Okay, which means we can get rid of these placeholders, giving us cleaner, more concise UI. Alright, how's it going? Checking on Webpack. Webpack is green, which means happy. Reload the page. Now we're getting our posts. Good. Give me a thumbs up if you have this working. Okay, well, it sounds like we can use a few more minutes. So I usually pause the video when people are working, so I'm gonna pause this. And if you have any problems debugging, let me know and we'll work through it.
I don't see it on localhost. Sorry.
On localhost, all right. Well, I mean, it's a warning. It's not gonna crash the code, so just cross our fingers.
No, I mean I don't see it displayed on the server.
Okay, so we have our rendering properly happening. That's good. Let's submit a few fake comments as well. Like let's get this guy hooked up, right? And then let's connect it to our Redux architecture. So the next thing we want to do is we're going to bind some functions to these inputs, right? So whenever the user types into an input, we need to know about it, obviously, right? So here on the input, let's bind an onChain function to this update next post. Okay, so here I'm binding a function called update next post, which doesn't exist. That function doesn't exist. So this will crash, so don't run it yet. Don't test it. It's not going to work. So let's go ahead. Sorry?
We can use a function too. And for no use bind this when no.
Yeah, it's just a regular function. So
yeah.
let's go ahead and create this function. So right here. And we'll just do a console log right now, just to make it really easy. So now it should work, assuming that nothing, we didn't make any other mistakes. So let's test it. So we reload and just type some stuff in here, and you should see that guy pop up. Good. So now we have user interaction at least properly being captured. Obviously, we need to know what the user's typing, right? So let's go ahead and do that. This is coming from an input. Yes?
Sorry, can I see that bind function again?
Yeah, right here.
I missed it.
Right here.
Yeah, so it's bind.
Right. This is where I was going anyway, so this is the right spot. So right here, we're inside an input div. Whenever you bind a function to the onChain, it includes an event argument by default. So let's go ahead and use that. That gives you some information, pretty much all the information you need of what's being typed into. So while we're here, I'm going to bind the same function to the text area. So that's also a user input area, right? Let's go ahead and do that right here. So we're going to use the same function twice, one for the title and one for the text area, okay? Which means we need some way of distinguishing which input is being typed into, right? Otherwise, we don't know if it's the title or the text. So these are just functions like any other function, which means we can insert more arguments. So here, I'm inserting a text argument, just a string called title, which will tell me which input is being typed into, and this is telling me which input is being typed into. Which means we will receive that argument on the function, on the implementation. Okay, so let's go ahead and use that. So head back up to the implementation, and we'll call that attribute, or just attr, and event. All right. And then this way we can decipher which attribute is being updated using the the input as well as the event. You guys see what I'm doing here? So title equals whatever is being typed into, right? Text equals whatever. That's the thought process here. So let's test it out. Reload the page. That's the title. Very good. There's the text. So now we can distinguish which one is which. Progress. Okay. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Who's got this working? All right. Nice. Okay, so now what we want to do is store those values, capture those values. So let's go back to state. We'll use state for that as well. You don't really have to, but why not? And let's create an object in state called next post, which has title and text, right? So title and text. Alrighty, so that means in here on line 22, everything afterwards at least, is where we have to update the next post from the state. So if you've done React already, you probably already know this, but I'll just re-articulate because it's very important. What you don't want to do is directly mutate the state attribute. So very often, if you're new to React, what people will do, and I'm guilty of this too when I was first starting out, is directly mutating the state like this, right? This is a very intuitive thing to do right here because we're just updating state attributes on this object inside the state. That's what you're supposed to do in conventional JavaScript. In React, you do not do this. This is bad, okay? What you do is you create a copy, you mutate the copy, and then you reset the state, okay? So what you want to do instead here is you want to what you want to do is create a copy, so we'll call it update. Next post, yeah, next post. And we update that guy instead, so. And then you reset the state. So lines 27, 28, 29, that's where you redefine the state attribute. That's how you do that. Because that's a React-specific concept. It's not like a JavaScript thing, it's a React thing. So you have to understand that that's how you mutate state. And that also applies inside the Redux architecture. So we want to actually get to this in Redux as well, figuring out how to apply the same concepts in a Redux project, which is what this is. So hopefully soon we'll be doing this inside Redux as well. Okay, so let's check in on Webpack. Webpack is good. And let's make sure we can reload the app. And, all right. Now there's no visual confirmation, so we're just checking that nothing broke, right? So then let's go back here and create a function on this button which will submit the new post, right? So let's do on click this.submit post. All right. Same as before, this function doesn't exist, so don't try it yet, it's going to crash. Go back and define the function. We'll just do a quick console log, and we'll make sure that everything works. Okay? So does everyone see this? All right, let's try it out. So submit post. Since we already have the updated values stored in state, let's render those values. Why not? We have them, right? So let's just do that. This.state.nextPost. And this way we can confirm whether or not everything was actually captured accurately, right? We can just double check that, is my point. So let's try it. Test, this is my first post. Get rid of all this, press submit, and here it is right there with the values successfully being rendered from the state. So it means we've successfully, accurately captured the values. So here it is again, just in case you missed it. Just make sure you have that. How you guys doing? Good? Good. Something wrong? You gotta work on it? Good. How about you guys? Good. Just give me a thumbs up so I know. Oh, great, everyone's got it. All right, let's move ahead then. So now let's get this post inside the array. So same idea. Let's create a copy of the array. So here we're creating a copy of the array posts. Same concept. You don't mutate state. You make a copy, update the copy, then reset. So then here, updated. We're going to add the new post, and then reset the state. Right? Same general principle, right? You make a copy, mutate the copy, reset the state, and line 37 is where we do that. That's how you update state in React. Let's try it out. So here, test, this is my first post, and then there it is right there. That's it. Good. You guys have the same behavior? And you can continue doing this, right? So I can do test 2, another post. Test 2. Etc., etc., etc. You can just keep on doing it. How's that working out for you guys? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Great. Oh no, all right. Just give it a minute or two. While we're on this component still, let's get into the sort of the distinction, the classification of containers. So like, why is there a containers directory? Why did we write this code in a containers directory? Because generally the way you want to think of it, containers essentially contain data. Essentially, it's sort of like a slang way of thinking about it. But think about what's going to happen here from a more full stack standpoint, right? This data right here, will come from an API, right? And that API will deliver the data, and it'll eventually end up here. Wherever it ends up, that's the container. That's a good rule of thumb. It's not 100%, but that's really why it's called a container. It contains the data, right? And then, then what that means is, that begs the question is, what other types of components are there? Like, we only have a containers directory. Well, the other type is called a presentation component. Oftentimes, the distinction is called smart versus dumb, where containers are the smart components and presentation are the dumb components. That's sort of the slang distinction. But it's the same division. Right, so this is the smart component, and now we have to write some dumb components whose only job is to literally render content. Okay, and the way it'll come back. The way I think about it is dumb components just sit there and look pretty. That's all they do. They just sit there and look pretty, right? So within the context of this component, the dumb component is right here, lines 50 through 54. That should be its own component that we render, who only inherits data and then renders it. That's it. So while we're sort of on this, let's take care of that. So here, let's go back to our SRC components. We don't even have any other directory for components. Let's create one right now. Let's call it presentation. let's cd into that. Let's create an index, and let's create a, what's a good name for that? Let's call it preview. Because we might not want to put the entire post there, right? Maybe just like a snippet of the additional text. So let's call it preview. Head back to the root level. Okay, so this presentation layer right here, this preview component, head over to the index inside the presentation component directory, excuse me. All right, good, I am recording this. Sometimes I forget to resume the recording, that's not good. So let's import the preview. Export it right here. Okay, now the preview component will do one thing and essentially one thing only, render data. That's it. So what that means is it doesn't need state. It doesn't care about state. It doesn't manipulate data. It doesn't make an API request. It doesn't do any of that stuff. It just renders data. So from that standpoint, we want to use a simpler component definition called a stateless component, or technically a stateless functional component. So we're going to do that right now. Whereby the entire component is just one function that returns some HTML. That's it. So going back to our container, I'll pop right back there in a second, so don't worry. I just grabbed these 4 lines of code, and I'm just going to dump it in right here. And we don't need the key. And that's it. That's our stateless functional component. However, these values, post.title, post.text, those will come from the props. Okay, so those are props.title, props.text. Okay? So this is like the simplest component possible. This is essentially like pure HTML within a React project. That's a stateless functional component. Okay, so we want to render this instead of those like 4 lines of divs. This is a better architecture. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Before I do, is everyone good on this? So we go back to our sub, and we import that guy. So what is it? Preview, right? Preview from presentation. I'm pretty sure I spelled that right. And then down here, instead of rendering these divs over and over again, we just render the preview. You still need to pass in the key. So you pass in the key like that, and then just get rid of all the other stuff we had before, and we should be good to go. So let's test it out. Oh. Yeah, props. Yeah. I was wondering if anyone caught that. Props. So post equals post. Now we're set to go.
Wouldn't you want it to be title and text?
Sorry?
Wouldn't you want it to be title and text?
Oh no, you can pass in the entire JSON, and then it'll parse it inside here. Props. Did I mess it up? You might be right about that. Well, this is a better way to do it. Let's do it this way. ... Now this is the way I normally do it anyway. So here you're passing in the entire object, and the word post is essentially props. So that's kind of why I crossed up for a second. Okay. Cool. This spread operator right here, it was a little confusing when I first learned about it, but it's actually very easy to understand when you see the other way. So here, don't copy this, just watch me. So I do title equals post.title, and then text equals post.text. These two are equivalent. Okay, these are literally the same result. So the spread operator just gives you a quicker way to do this instead. So, because if you imagine, like sometimes a post might have like 40 attributes. Then you've got 40 lines of this going on. That's crazy. You can just do this instead. So these are the same. Alrighty, let me just get rid of this. Just doing some housekeeping here, just doing cleanup. And then I'm going to add another post real quick. Just make sure I didn't break that part. And then let's move on to the next thing. So, all right, cool. So that's good. Now, what we're doing is, so far, we have all this being maintained inside the state of the container, right? Which is basically right now we're only using React to maintain the state. We're not using Redux at all, right? So this is right now it's just a React project. Now, in reality, it would normally stay this way because it's a very simple project. But if we want to use Redux, excuse me, all this data here, lines 14 through 18, wouldn't be here. It would be in the Redux architecture. So the idea behind Redux is there's a global state that applies to the entire project. And all the components of the project can react to changes in global state if they choose to do so. And that's the fundamental sort of thought process behind Redux. Okay? If you think about it, Redux is just analogizing the entire project as one big component. If you think of it that way, it actually quite simplifies the whole thought process. And the real remaining challenge is just the mechanics and organizing your data. Okay? So in Redux, we have this thing called the store, which is your global state. That's your state for the entire project. So we really want to put this data in the store and then have this component respond to changes in the store. That's the better way to do this. And then there's also the situation of dealing with changes in data. Okay, and that happens through what's called actions. Okay, so what happens is when we want to create, update the data somehow. In this case, add a new post. That's going to happen through an action, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an action. Something's happening, and then that action delivers information about the action to a file called a reducer. So the store is really a collection of reducers. This is an important thing to understand. So the store is really comprised of a series of reducers, where each reducer is responsible for its own subset of data. So in my architectures, typically, those subsets are divided by schemas. So if you think about this project right here, we already have two schemas off the bat, a user and a post. Right? Every project has a user, and in this project we have a post. That's two schemas right there, right? Two data types, I guess. So in my projects, that would be two reducers, the post reducer and the user reducer. Okay, that's the way I do my projects. I've seen other people do reducers by container. So in this case, that would be like sub reducer. Right, I've seen that as well. So it's kind of to each his own, but I like doing it by data type. All right. So that's a very, very, very high level overview of Redux and how the thought process works. And the rest is plumbing. Just how do you get it to work? Right. So that's the rest of the challenge per se. Obviously, it gets more complicated. But fundamentally, the React Redux thought process is basically simple. Store components, change, and that's it. And then the rest is how do you make all that happen. Okay, so we're going to get into that. Before I do, a couple of things worth pointing out. So I've been doing React professionally now for a little over a year, by meaning like clients pay me to do React projects, React Native, React Redux, stuff like that. A large number of my projects in the past year have come from people who've architected React projects poorly. And there's a commonality that I've noticed amongst these projects. The commonality is that they try to shoehorn an Angular thought process into a React Redux architecture. I've seen this a couple times now, not just once, like a handful of times. So what do I mean by that? So has anyone here done Angular 1? Okay, that's a good thing if you haven't done it. It's a good thing. Because what you have to do is get rid of all that thought process. So Angular 1 heavily revolves around what's called MVC, Model View Controller. Has anyone here heard of that concept before? Okay. So MVC dominated the thought process paradigm up until recently, really, I think in the last year or so. MVC basically maintains that your areas of your app control their own areas of data. So imagine your reducers that I described here actually belong in the containers. And then you have a container which has its own reducer and that's it. And then some other container with its own reducer and that's it. You're shoehorning an MVC thought process into a React Redux architecture. That's where problems begin. That's your first mistake right there. And if you build out your entire architecture based on that, projects get complicated very quickly. Before you know it's unmaintainable. Because if you have a component pushing changes to its own reducer that some other component is not connected to, then you have to figure out some way to sort of transfer those changes over. You now have an MVC problem. You have an Angular problem in a React project, right? So it became I've seen a couple code bases sort of spiral out of control to where it becomes unmaintainable for that reason, right? So this is really where you want to make sure you understand the thought process and the architecture rather than just how things work, right? Because otherwise you could be really good at setting up all these components and whatnot and still do it the wrong way and cost your client tens of thousands of dollars. That's not good, right? That's how you lose a client. So the reason I'm pointing that out is because I'm seeing it more and more. It's an industry thing I've noticed more and more recently in the past 6 to 9 months. So as you progress in your careers, don't be that guy. So that's the main message there. So before I continue, how's everyone's code? Good? All right, so now let's throw all this garbage into the Redux architecture, right? So luckily, the scaffold already gives us Redux all set up. If you close all these files, you'll see inside here, this directory structure, a lot of the words I just said. Actions, stores, reducers, and a couple others we didn't talk about. But those are the important ones, right? Store, reducer, actions, right? So we have, at least now, we have one key data type, the post, right? So let's go ahead and go to the SRC, and then the reducers, and then right now we have the user reducer. That's an example that we're not going to use. Let's create a post reducer instead. So, and this will be responsible for maintaining the data that we currently have inside the state. Okay, so let's open that up. The post reducer, all reducers are responsible for maintaining state for whatever subset of data you're talking about. So to begin with that, you need what's called the initial state. So let's set up the initial state. And before we had posts. So you see how we're setting this up the same way as we did as the component, the container, right? In fact, I'm going to go as far as actually just grabbing the initial contents from the container and just reusing it over here, just recycling it. Okay, so that's our initial state. Okay, the actual reducer is just a function. Reducers are just functions. So state. Okay, so it takes 2 arguments, state and action. The state argument in line 12, if it's null, it defaults to the initial state. That's what that means right there. And the action is what I was describing before. Remember when I said actions deliver changes to reducers. So this is where that change is received by the reducer right here. Okay, actions have a couple key characteristics, but the one that matters the most is called type. Okay, the type, every action has a type. Every single action has a type. And the type fundamentally describes the action that's taking place, right? So for us, it would be like post created, right? Post added, user registered, user changed password. These are actions, right? So here, what we do is we set up the reducer response based on what action type has been delivered. That's the thought process here. So that's typically done through a switch statement. Using the action type as our sort of, determining what happens, right? Now over here, this is where fundamentally the state is being changed. Right here. That's why I said the store is a little misleading. It's actually a collection of reducers. So you can think of this as like a piece of the store, right? So here is where we're making changes in state. So what we want to do, like before, is we don't mutate the actual state. We make a copy, update the copy, and then return the copy. Same thought process here. So what I'm going to do here is make a copy right now. Okay, and the default just returns it. Nothing happens, so we just return it. Okay, so this is a reducer. It's a fully qualified reducer that does nothing. That's it. Okay. So now let's have one action that does something. So here we set up a case for that. Post added, right? Added. And for now, I'm going to have this do nothing as well. But the only thing I am going to do is console log. Come on, there we go. Okay, so this is pretty worthwhile pointing out. You know how I said every action has a type, which is true. Every action has to have a type. Beyond that, it can have whatever else you want. So we can bind whatever other keys we want to the action, as many as we want. So here, I'm going to bind the data key, which is going to be the new post in this case. So when I say post added, I'm going to deliver the actual new post itself right here in that data key. Okay, and then we're going to update the posts. So I'm going to make one small change right here in the initial state. Instead of post, I'm going to call it all. Okay, so make sure you catch that. We good? So now this is a new reducer, right? We created it from scratch. So now we got to register the reducer in the store. The store does not know about this reducer, so it's not going to pick up anything. So we have to go to the reducers index and export our reducer. So we just export it right here. Now we head over to the stores right here and click on the index right here inside the stores, which is really just a store. And on line 3 up there, we import that new reducer we just created, right? Line 3, you guys catch that? And then the most important line is right here, line 18, is where we add the new reducer. You see where it says combine reducers? Right, and then this generated code does the rest. This code right here pretty much will never change, except for what we're doing right now, adding new reducers. Okay? For the most part, I just ripped this off the actual Facebook documentation. So it's a very standard store, and the only thing you need to do is add reducers as you make them, or remove them if you change your mind. That's really the only real thing happening here. It gets a little bit more tricky when you get to server-side rendering, but not a lot more tricky, just a little bit more, okay? So now our store has been registered with the reducer. other way around. Our reducer has been registered with the store. So it's good to go. Everything's connected. I'm going to check in on Webpack, make sure I didn't make any mistakes, which is good. I didn't. Everyone else do the same thing. Do you see any red lines on your Webpack? Good. Good. And let's go ahead now over to the index of the SRC. Back to the root of the project. Right here. So we don't have to make any changes here, but the reason I'm pointing this out is to explain the provider now. So a React project is not a Redux project until you insert the provider. Okay? That's pretty much all you need to know about this. And the provider is what provides the store. This line right here, line 8, is what matters the most. The store from our stores file has been sent to our project via the provider. So now this is it always was a Redux project because of that reason. So the Redux part was already set up for us. Okay? So what we can do right now is just reload the app and make sure it doesn't break. Good, didn't break. Now let's go ahead and use the data from the store, i.e. the reducer. Okay? So before I get into all that, because we're about to do a lot more coding, is everyone working? Yeah? Good? Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Let's head back to our container, the sub container. Right. We now need to connect this container to the store, which has not happened yet. So this container is not connected to Redux. Even though the entire project is, this container is not. So I don't know if you caught earlier when I said every component can respond to changes to the store if it chooses to do so. Right now is where we're going to make that decision for this component. So what we do next is we import the store. I'm sorry, not the store, the connect. We literally connect this container via a function called connect. So that's what that guy is. Okay, everyone got that? And then we head back down. We head down to the bottom. What to set up a function here called? Sorry, question. Good.
No.
Okay, so we head down here and we create a function called state2props. This line is confusing, these 4 lines of code, so I'll briefly explain it, but really you won't understand it until you see it working. That's when you'll understand. So here, this state argument in this function right here is the store. You really could even just call it the store, and basically it's fine. This is more just a convention that I see mostly. It's a state. And within the state, we have 2 reducers. What are they? User and post. Right here, we're telling the container to listen for the post reducer. That's what we're saying right here. We're saying this container cares about that reducer. And we can add all the reducers if we want. We can add as many as we want, right? So then if the user reducer changes, this guy won't update. It won't care about it. If the post container reducer changes, this guy will respond to it. It will react to those changes. So the next thing we got to do is actually connect it. And now this container is officially a connected container. It is now truly a smart component. Okay? So what that means is any changes to the post reducer will trigger an update on this container. Any changes, right? So first thing we want to do, you see where it says this.state.posts right here on line 50?
Props.
Sorry?
No.
Yeah, okay, line 50 right here, for me at least, line 50, where it says that, get rid of that, and just leave that behind. It used to be this, and now just get rid of that. Instead of state, we're going to use the store. That is our state now, right? So go over here and do const posts equals this.props.post.all. Okay, now before I go ahead and explain this, let's just make sure I didn't break anything. So here's Webpack. Webpack is good. If I reload, we're seeing the same post because it's the same thing in the reducer anyway. However, if I go to the reducer, the post reducer, I'm going to get rid of all the posts except the first one now. And now I only see the first one, thereby confirming this data is coming from the reducer. Does that make sense? Because it's different data. It's a different array. Okay, so before I explain, just make sure you're seeing the same thing. So here's what happened. Down here on line 73 through 77, what this is saying is that this post reducer is going to be assigned as a property to this container. That's why the function is called state2props. Does that make sense? So this post reducer right here is assigned as a property to the container, hence the name state2props. That's what happens by virtue of this connect function. This connect function literally applies that change for you. So I am now referencing that property right here, this.props.post. And then if you recall, I changed the name of the array to all. Remember I did that? That's where I'm referencing right here. The reason I did that is because posts.post is a little confusing. So I kind of saw that coming a few minutes ahead, and I was like, let me just tweak this real quick to minimize that confusion. So that makes sense? So this.props.post exists by virtue of the connect function. Make sense? So if I go back here and I add one more, all right, I'm in the reducer now. If I add one more, it should show up here, which it does, right? So what that means is I can go up here in the container, and these guys are done. Okay? Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. You see, we don't need these anymore, right? We're not using this data anymore. It's now coming from the reducer. However, if you recall, when you submit a post, what's happening? It's still using this array, which we don't want to use anymore. So now when we submit a post, we have to send that data also to the reducer, right? Does that make sense? So now we got to do that. Because this right here, that's no bueno. This is not going to work anymore, right? So all this stuff has to go as well. Because now we got to send that through the Redux cycle, which is our next challenge. Let's figure that out now. Okay, how are we doing with this? So whenever we make a change to the data in the reducer, that's done through what? Action. Something's happening. So we have to create an action which will add a post to the reducer. That's the next objective. So let's head over here, actions, and let's do that. So a couple more sample actions here. So the scaffold gives you a lot of examples. They're just examples. They're just meant for your own benefit. So in other words, you don't have to use these. Like if you comment all this out, nothing's going to break. So let's do that, right? Because it's just examples. So what we're going to do is create a new action. Actions are just functions. Okay, so let's create our new action, add post, right? Add post. Every action has a what?
Type.
Type. Thank you. And then beyond that, you can add whatever key you want. Well, who remembers what key we decided earlier? Data. Which is going to be the post. Now, what should this action type be? Who can remember?
Add post.
Correct. How do you know that?
Because that's what we called it in the, I don't know where, but add capital underscore post.
In the what file?
Reducer.
Reducer, exactly. So in the reducer, right here, we already made this decision. We may have forgotten, but if we did forget, this is where we can recall, right? So we don't have a choice here, right? We have to call it this. So we go back here, and we do add post. Oh, I'm sorry, post added, excuse me. Right, so the hard part here in all these projects is remembering where all the connections are made. That's really the hard part. And people get lost in the minutia, which is understandable. It's not, there's a lot to keep track of. But the actual concepts are not really that complicated. It's just really remembering where all the pieces connect. So that's why I emphasize what file. That's important to know where the pieces connect. So now that we have that, we now have an action that delivers what's happening to the reducer, right? So now the question is, how do we use this action? So we go back to our, someone's hand up?
No.
Okay. We go back to our container, and we have to use that action right here, right? It's time to use it right here. So now, how do we do that? So we go back to our top, and we import the actions. I believe it's 2 levels up. 1, 2, yeah, 2 levels up. So you import the actions. And go back to the bottom, all the way in the bottom now. And we create another function called dispatch to props. We don't technically call the actions. The store calls the actions through what's called a dispatch. That's technically what happens. For the most part, though, it's kind of like a proxy. So it's okay if we think of it as us calling the actions. It's not going to it's not going to mess you up if you think of it that way. So what we can do is create a new action called add post. But like I say, the dispatch is what literally calls it. It's a little confusing. I wouldn't worry, again, too much about the plumbing behind this. But what matters is that this function right here that we wrote a few minutes ago is what we're going to call when we call that. Okay? And just like state to props, like literally the same as state to props, we can take dispatch to props and add it to the connect function, which will do the same thing. So this container now has another property called what? Add post, which is a function which will run this dispatch. That's the thought process here. So before I do that, everyone got this? Yeah. So we go back up here. Now we use that, this.props.addPost. And we grab the next post. Now who remembers what's going to happen if this is successful? Who remembers? Right, so again, the real challenge here is keeping the mental map in your head straight. Right, that's the real challenge. The actual concepts, again, I don't think they're that challenging, but there are too many pieces moving around. That's where it's easy to get lost, right? So in this scenario, and if you don't remember, it's fine, but where do you find out? In the reducer, right? Who receives actions? Reducers. So we go to the post reducer, and according to we only have one action here. According to the case, what's going to happen? Just a console log, and that's it. No actual mutation will happen, right? Assuming we did this right. So let's test it out. So Open the console, just type in some stuff, get rid of this, and then look at that right here. That's what matters the most. You see that? Post reducer line 15. The console log we left behind. You see that? Okay? It's a little hard to see. It's small text, but the second line of the console log is what matters the most. So what does this confirm for us? Correct. The reducer has successfully received the action. That's what that confirms. Which now means we can do stuff. We can actually do something with it. Who else has this working? Sounds like
It's saying dispatch is not defined. So wondering if I missed. Oh,
okay. Now that we've confirmed that this is being successfully received, now we can do something that matters, right? So here, what we can do is grab the all array. So let all equals object. And again, you see how I'm just making copies? Updated all. And then we add the new post. We just add the new post. And then we reassign. And that's it. So within a Redux architecture, this right here, line 19 really, is synonymous to set state. Which means this line right here, line 19, is what will trigger a re-render on your container, or as many containers that are registered to it. Like you can register 1,000 containers to this one reducer, and they'll all propagate. That's what you want. Right? That's the magic of Redux, which maintaining individual state would be a nightmare, right? To do the same thing, you'd have to have this same data sort of shared across 10 component containers and synced up using some sort of notification system, which is what I see people try and do in a React project. No, if you find yourself doing that, something is wrong. That shouldn't be happening. Okay, so here, let's try it out. Test, hello, and there it is, coming from Redux. Everyone else have that working too? At this juncture, I'm going to do a quick deploy, just to make sure everything is still working on staging. So let's try that right now. So turbo deploy. So that'll take about 1 to 2 minutes anyway. A lot of things we didn't get into tonight that, for the sake of time, to be honest. Obviously, we're not persisting to a database, right? So that creates another layer of challenge in this environment. Our actions are immediately responded to when the user makes a change. That's called a synchronous action. But if you think about it from an API standpoint, your API might be slow today. You might have a poor connection. You might post a comment and it might take 3 seconds to return data. It's a slow connection, right? Or you're on a subway or whatever. That means your action cannot return right away. It should not return right away. It has to wait for it to respond. That's called an asynchronous action, where the dispatch doesn't get invoked until the completion of the function. That's called an asynchronous action. That's a more challenging concept of React Redux, how to hook that up inside of a React Redux architecture. Okay? This is up. Let me just double check this real quick. Okay, so here it is on staging. So everyone try the same thing. Hello. Does this thing work? And there it is. There it is right there. Okay? Other things to be considerate of is how do we bind more properties to these comments? For example, if I'm a registered user, right, How do I make sure that the comments are attributed to the correct user? How do I do things like that? Another challenge is how do I create a live chat style environment here, right? So for example, if we're all on the same subreddit, right, and I want to create like a live feed type of thing, more like a Discord server, I guess, then when you post and you post, we all want to see it. Right? How would you do something like that? Right? These are all challenges to consider within a React Redux project. Right? Rather than just like how to make it work at all, that's challenge number one. How do you even just make that work, period? Right? But at the next level is how do you make that work within a React Redux architecture with good architecture? Right? How do you architect that in the first place? And these are the challenges of a React Redux project. Before I kind of wrap it up, does anyone have any questions? Anything in the code you want to review? Anything that you want to?
I have a general Redux question.
Yeah.
Is Redux something where you need to use from the beginning?
So,
or is it something that you could add?
Yeah, very good question. You can add it later. That's a definite. What's your name? Philip. So what Philip's asking is, how do you make the decision of when to use Redux, right? Like, if you decide to use it later, ostensibly you didn't think you needed it in the first place, right? So like, and then you maybe change your mind down the road. So the question then becomes, what would make you change your mind? How do you make that decision in the first place? Before I get into it, does anyone have any thoughts on the matter? Okay, so the biggest benefit of the Redux store is the shared state. So if I have 10 components responding to the same state of one reducer, that's where I get the most gains. That's where Redux really pays dividends. So in this environment, would it have really been useful? It's only one container. This is overkill. This is an over-optimized example of Redux. However, if I know going in that I'm going to have at least 2 components register to the same data, immediately it's Redux. So it's not a matter of degree, like, oh, it's only 2, it's only 3, I'm just going to stick with regular state for now. No, as soon as you get to 2, go to Redux. That's the way I look at it. Because if you already know you're going to have 2 components at least, chances are pretty soon it's going to be 3 and 4 then 5, right? So if you go on Turbo, if you're already logged in, Redux is all over this place, right? And here, this is a component right here. All the way on top, it's called the nav bar, right? This is another component. This is another component. But they're all rendering the same piece of data, me, because I'm logged in. Does that make sense? So Redux is what's making that possible. Component 1, component 2, component 3 are all rendering the same data from the Redux store. They don't have their own component state where this data is maintained. If it did, that defeats the purpose of Redux. Obviously, this is a little bit more robust than like a simple project, but even if it was just 1, 2, I would go right to Redux. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a good question. Any other questions?
I'm sorry, I just walked in late.
That's fine.
Can you just give me a high-level overview of the entire architecture? Could you just break it down to certain actions, reducers, logic?
Yeah, I'll do it real quick.
Just a quick.
Because I kind of went through it pretty fast anyway, to be honest. So React.
And it's going to be on GitHub by any chance with the README file?
No, but it's going to be on my website.
Oh.
So normally in my demos, I actually go a little bit slower, to be honest, and I use this diagram to illustrate the concept. So this is actually a pretty good case to do so. Okay, where are the markers? Matt, do you know where the markers are? Is it behind you? This doesn't matter. All right, so here, in our project that we wrote today, I'm recording all this, don't worry. I'm recording all this. Yeah, it's all being recorded, so you have to. I appreciate it. But it's, in our project that we wrote tonight, this component right here, well, who can tell me what component is this?
Container.
Yeah, literally, in our case, what is it?
EMS.
The stub, the container, right? This is the the store. It literally is called the store anyway, right? So that's what we have in our projects. We don't have all 3 of these. We have 1, but in our case, what is it called? preview. And this is the preview component, right? We don't have three presentation layers, so it's just container preview or sub preview, right? Here is where we wrote the action, add post. That's this right here, right? And then from here to here, we only have one reducer that we use, the post reducer. And when we click the button where it says dispatch actions.addPost, that's this line right here. And that's what's happening right here. As soon as the reducer propagates a change and returns the update, where it says literally it was line 19, return updated, right? That's this happening right here. That's this line right here, right? And then whenever the state changes, or the store, this container will re-render because it's connected. So do you see where at the bottom it says state 2 props? That's this line right here. Literally the yellow line. That's state 2 props. That's what establishes that connection. So whenever anything inside here changes, which is really a reducer change, then this will re-render, and then the whole thing will reload. Think of it like a refresh, which isn't like literally refreshing the page, but that's from a component standpoint, that's the way it's happening. Okay? This is sort of my go-to diagram, but the diagram is lacking in one key area, or a couple, but the one that point out the most is that there's only one container here, so even within this diagram, Redux is overkill, because there's only one container. So really, how should it look? There should be this, and then another one over here, right? Another one over here, like imagine like 20, all connected to the store. That would be the more appropriate usage scenario, okay? And then the reducer, there would be like 10 of these, right? So just imagine this diagram's like a little bit more expanded, okay? That's as quickly as I can kind of do.
But why do we need 10 reducers? You said that a singular source of truth, right? One single store which will basically update all the components. That's what the whole Redux concept is, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Then why do we need 10 reducers?
Well, the reducer, okay, so the store
Okay.
is a composition of reducers.
So the store is a composition of reducers.
Yeah, so it's like I said, it's a little misleading.
Okay.
But you have 10 reducers, 5 reducers, 8 reducers. You take all those reducers and you package them in the store. They become the store. Does that make sense?
I know. So
So
the store is basically a bunch of what do you call it? Data, right? I mean, which I'm pulling from an API or something of that sort.
we didn't get to that tonight, but
Okay.
that's fair. Yes.
No, because I kind of forked a GitHub project wherein I'm trying to track the values of cryptocurrencies. And basically, I pull the cryptocurrency values, real-time values.
Oh, we'll get to that later. That's not something that we can answer
So
in a short
basically, I populate the
definition.
store with data from a third-party website, correct?
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay.
That's like using an API.
Okay.
So, cool. I mean, there's a million diagrams that you can look at for a similar like explanation, but I like to keep it simple. So,
Okay.
any other questions or clarification in the code that you want to go over?
So, and what exactly is a reducer made up of? What constitutes a reducer?
Well, a reducer is like a subsection of the store.
Okay.
Okay, so it's basically like where you store a piece of data
Okay.
rather than the entire data, all the data. It's a gross oversimplification, but that's the way I look at it. Okay, so reducers are responsible for a subcategory of data. The way I organize my reducers. Okay. So a couple things moving ahead. It's 8:40, 8:50. So it's been about an hour and a half. So basically tonight would have been a good example of a sample class, but faster. So normally I would cover what we covered tonight in 3 hours in an actual class. And I would make sure everyone, but this workshop is actually pretty strong. Wouldn't you agree? Like everyone basically kept up. So this is a stronger group. What I try and do is tweak my pace based on the strengths or weaknesses of the room, and I adjust accordingly. The offerings that make most sense for you guys are the React deep dive coming up. Turbo. right here. So I'm doing an intro course. I'm not teaching this one. My TA is, but the React deep dive, I'm teaching this one. And here, basically, we just create a bunch of examples based on real life projects that get more and more sophisticated. So the the challenges I was explaining a few minutes ago, like asynchronous functions, user authentication, server-side rendering, React router. How do you composite a React router with Redux on the server-side rendering? That's hard. Okay, and we wouldn't even get to that until around here anyway, towards the end. Google Maps. How do you maintain a Google Maps integration with React Redux? Things of that nature are what I do here in the evening course starting next week for React Redux. It's Tuesdays, Thursdays, 6 to 9 p.m. for 4 weeks. It's sort of in and out. It's meant for people of your caliber, people who are not beginners, people who even have some professional experience, who have completed App Academy, who've completed GA, like some rigorous places, Grace Hopper, places like that. So that's number one. Another option is the weekend crash course. The next one is December 8th, which is a Saturday. It's a 2-day crash course, the 8th and the 9th, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. in this room. That's where we did the last one, at least. That's basically what we did tonight on steroids. We just, what was tonight, an hour and a half? I just go 8 hours straight. And that's it. And I come back the next day, I go 8 hours straight. And then people have to basically tell me to break for lunch. I'll skip lunch if people are willing to sit for 8 hours and just code. So it's just a matter of what you can handle. So the weekend crash course is more like, just get ready to code until you can't code physically anymore.
So what is the prerequisite to understand the weekend crash course? So what is the knowledge prerequisite that we need to have?
This room is pretty good for it. So this room is pretty good for it.
Okay.
You should not be coming in as a beginner. The crash course is not suitable for beginners.
Okay.
The last weekend crash course we had was 4 people, all of whom are currently professional devs. They currently work professionally as developers, and even they had a hard time keeping up. So it was just, my foot's on the gas the whole time. But you will learn. That I can guarantee. I don't leave people behind in a paid class. That's unprofessional. You will learn. That much I can guarantee. So those are my offerings coming up. A couple other things I'll just leave you with on a more personal note. My guess is that almost everyone, if not everyone in this room, is a programmer from another career. That's my guess.
Yeah.
I don't know, lawyers, doctors, whatever. I'm no different. I was a teacher in 2009, a high school math teacher, AP Calculus and Stats. And I decided this was not what I want to do as a career. So I switched over into programming in 2010, having taught myself. So I did not major in CS. I didn't build computers when I was 12, 13. I was not one of those kids, which is a very important thing I try to convey. I was able to completely switch, not mid-career, it was early career, but it wasn't in college, is my point. Right? I was 2 years out of college. I was a couple years out of school before I picked up my first programming book. Right? So why does that even matter? So the point is I've been there. I've successfully navigated that situation. I've negotiated well. There are things I would have done different, but it's still, I figured it out. How did I figure it out? Everything I do is based on supply and demand dynamics. You can probably tell as an econ major. So in 2010, what was the first thing I learned? iOS, right? Because I knew if I have any chance in this game, it's going to have to be wherever the demand is highest. Because at that point, I was a couple years out of college. There's a bunch of 12-year-olds who are better than me in programming, and they're going to be 22 in a decade, and I just can't catch up to them. However, in 2010, iOS has been around for 2 years, and the demand is crazy high. So my calculus was the following. Nobody in the world has more than 2 years of iOS experience. It doesn't exist. So if I'm going to get an entry point, that's a good place to start as long as the demand is crazy high. Well, that was a very easy dynamic to recognize. In hindsight, it's very easy, but people often, at the time even, people ask, why don't you do Android instead? Right? Because it has higher market share. Everyone keeps telling me that. It has higher market share. It's not about the market share for me. It's who spends the money, right? So I bet Honda Civics sell way more than BMW 3 Series. Who spends the money, right? So I was looking for people who would spend money on iOS developers, right? And that's why I made the decision I made. At the time, it actually wasn't that obvious. At the time, it's like maybe Android is going to destroy iOS. Who knows, right? But I, just based on where I was living, and just every time I come to the city, the people I saw who were more potential customers were using iOS, if that makes any sense. Obviously, it was a non-scientific observation, but I saw the people with the money having iPhones. So I made my decision based on that. So the reason I'm sort of telling you this right now is because that mentality had never left me. That's what drives my entire career. So if you're starting out in programming, this is the perspective, the lenses through which I do everything in my classes. And with that said, React Redux is certainly a good choice. And then beyond that is React Native. React Native, if you got React Redux and Native down pat, right now the supply-demand curve is pretty close to what it was in iOS in 2010. iOS is still stronger 7 years ago, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close. I'm kind of sort of reliving that dynamic right now because this reminds me of 6 years ago. It kind of reminds me of that when I started out in 2012, so I guess that was 5 years ago. I started programming in 2010, but I didn't start my career until 2012. I needed about a year and a half till I was confident enough to move to New York City and drop everything and become a programmer with nothing lined up, by the way. I had no offers, I had no gigs, nothing. I just moved here with some savings, and I said, if I can't get a gig in 6 months, I wasn't qualified anyway. That was my thought process. It did not take me 6 months, it took me a few weeks. And then from there, just because iPhone. That's the reason why, iPhone. So it's not because I was good, right? It's not because I had a certain ability, I was talented. None of that's the case, just iPhone, right? And that's why I picked what I did. So as far as that goes, as far as today goes, React Native and Redux is a very solid choice. There are more that you can get into, blockchain technology, Ethereum, things like that, GraphQL, stuff like that. But this is certainly, I'm sort of like reminded of that dynamic right now. So that's it. I hope you got your code working. This will be on the website tonight or tomorrow morning, along with my code, so you can just download my code. And that's basically it. So hope you had fun.
Thank you.
Yep.